He's recording this. So again, Melissa Hamilton, I'm a professor of criminal law and criminal justice at the University of Surrey. You are here for the 8 Tips for University Sexual Misconduct Investigations. So this is part of what's called the Festival of Social Sciences, as you can see, because a lot of the tips that we are discussing today are based on science, so based on what the research says, but also it's based on the practical and professional experiences for some of your presenters. So as you can see, it's sponsored as well by the UKRI, the Economic and Social Research Council, and then hosted more specifically by the University of Surrey, although we have more than Surrey folks who are presenting on this call. Just briefly, I want to thank you all again for doing this work in terms of sexual misconduct investigations at universities. I don't have to tell you, but I can acknowledge that this is very hard work. Most people don't want to do it for various reasons. These can be very difficult cases. It can also be challenging because these are our students that we have a duty of care to and that we basically care about. And so sometimes when the students are reporting parties, but also when there are responding parties, sometimes our affiliations and our duties can feel conflicting. And so that will be addressed a little bit today as well. But again, just want to thank you for the service that you have here, because I think the reason that all of us are here is that we want to do better for our students. We want their experiences at university to be better. And when they're involved in a sexual misconduct claim, that can mar their experience, and we don't want to make it worse for them. So again, thank you for your services. So some of you will have been impacted by sexual misconduct, either vicariously through these stories of the students or maybe yourselves. And we will have a slide that will have sources, or at least we had emails that had sources for you to contact if you have been a victim or otherwise traumatized and need to reach out for something. So those contacts are there as well. So the slides today, a common question is, will the slides be made available? Yes, we'll send you through the email list a PDF of the slides, and we are videoing this, and the video of the presentations will be available to you as well. Your video, you can have your video on or off. It's entirely up to you. But we recommend that you be cognizant that when you're watching this and listening to this presentation, because it will be discussing things about sexual misconduct, that you be aware of who may be around you, that you may want to shelter either the visual or what they're hearing from that. And that being said, then is next slide, please. So your presenters today are in order of presentation. I am on the left, and you can see then we'll have Emily Setti, a senior lecturer in criminology from the University of Surrey, and each of these presenters may tell you a little bit more about themselves if they want. Next will be Clarissa DeSantis, that many of you may be quite familiar with. She does presentations all over and has a steep history in sexual misconduct investigation protocols in the UK. She's a sexual misconduct prevention and response manager at Durham. Then we have Ioana Anani, who used to be University of Surrey, but now is head of student conduct and compliance at St. George's. And then last but not least, just following it up, is then Amy Knight, who at the University of Surrey is case manager in the Office of Student Complaints, Appeals, and Regulations. So this is your lineup today. Next slide, please. So the general idea of the reason that we're putting on this, again, is all of us are here because we want to do better for our students in these particular cases, but we're also providing you a mix there, as you can see, of academics. So some of us are academics in various fields, such as criminology, law, criminal justice, social work, where we're offering our insights from the sciences and research. But we're also joined then by professional services professionals who are offering their practical experiences and pragmatic experiences about these cases. So what you're seeing then today is a team effort that hopefully we're offering best practices, although we want to hear from you as well. We will have that Q&A at the end. You can help us improve our knowledge as well. And then again, what we're all here for is to improve the outcomes for students that are involved in these cases. And next slide, and I'm going to then pass it off to the next presenter, Emily Setti. Emily, on. I knew Emily was going to be joining us late, so she may not be on quite yet. So let's go ahead and skip to the next one and let Emily come back when she's able to get on. Clarissa is next, and I will hand it off to you.
Hi, thank you, Melissa, and thanks everyone who's joining today. I'll start with tip 3, which is use trauma-informed investigation techniques to conduct safe, ethical, and more accurate investigations. So I'm going to talk through this tip and explain the reasons why we want to use trauma-informed investigation technique. In the scope of today's session, I can't explain how to do that in such a short period of time, but hopefully I'm going to give you enough information that will allow you to go and explore this topic further. So on the screen here, there are a number of statements that sometimes we hear investigators use when they're looking at a case, when they're presented with what I call counterintuitive behavior, behavior that they find in an investigation by the reporting party or the person who's reported they've been subjected to sexual violence, that they think, ooh, if they're doing this, their allegation couldn't possibly be true. So why didn't she say no? She could have said no. She could have said stop. She could have let this person know she wasn't consenting, but she's told me she said nothing. Why didn't she try to get away? No one was stopping her from leaving. The door was open. If this were to be true, why didn't she flee if she was so scared? Why didn't he fight back? This is a big lad. He's a rugby player. The person he's accused of assault is much smaller than him. If he was so scared and if this were to be true, why didn't he try to fight this person away? How could she not remember something so significant? She's told me something, but she's clearly left out this information that if the allegation were to be true, she should have remembered. Or, he can't get his story straight. He's told the first person one story, he's written his report in this way, and now when I've met with him as an investigator, he's told me a different story. These are all things that can come up in an investigation that an investigator can find and think, actually, we're concerned that this person might be lying about their allegations. But when we have a trauma-informed lens, this allows us to consider other lines of inquiry and understand those behaviors potentially from a different perspective that could lead us to more accurate investigation outcomes. Next slide, please. So why must investigations be trauma-informed? We know that trauma impacts an individual's response during an incident and how they produce memories during that incident. But we also know that after an incident, how they retrieve those memories and how they present are going to be impacted by trauma as well. If we don't have a trauma-informed lens, then when we look at how someone's acting in an incident and how they're remembering it and how they're responding afterwards, we could really misjudge and misanalyze our evidence. We know that trauma-informed interviewing is going to allow investigators to retrieve more complete and more reliable information because it's going to open up those lines of inquiry to fully investigate the case within the limitations of what we can investigate in a university setting. But it's also going to prevent the re-traumatizing of survivors because we know that investigations conducted poorly can actually be considered what is recalled in literature a second rape, where someone is actually re-traumatized through the investigation process itself, which we want to avoid because we don't want our processes to further harm any of our students or employees. And we know that trauma-informed approaches do not favor reporting parties or disadvantage responding parties in any way because it's going to provide more accurate outcomes. So trauma-informed investigation doesn't automatically mean that we're always going to find in favor of a reporting party. What it means is that we're going to fully be able to investigate a case and look at the evidence available to us for the best outcome. And we know a trauma-informed investigation is considered international best practice in these types of cases. Next slide, please. And we also want to recognize that when we're thinking about response memories and presentation, how this is going to impact. So although I can't go fully into how to run a trauma-informed investigation, just to give you an idea and want you to kind of think about this more thoughtfully and where we want to explore this further, is recognizing that when someone experiences trauma, they have an autonomic response, a defense mechanism that is unconscious, where their brain detects a threat and then chooses for them how to respond. So we often know about fight or flight, but we don't necessarily think about the other responses. Freeze or tonic immobility is the most common response to rape. 70% of those who are subjected to rape experience tonic immobility. So when we think about freeze, if the fire alarm went off right now, we'd all pause for a moment and determine if there's a threat. That's not the freeze I'm talking about. I'm talking about when we actually see the fire and we become frozen. Tonic immobility is when we detect that threat and our body, actually our muscles become rigid. We can't physically speak. We can't physically flee. We can't physically fight back. And in that state, that can last for seconds up to hours. And so knowing that it's an autonomic, unconscious response that our body is choosing for us helps us as investigators to recognize that potentially why someone didn't say no, why a big lad who plays rugby didn't fight back, why someone didn't leave when they could have. Recognizing that there are other explanations allows us to conduct more thorough investigations. We also see flop or collapsed immobility, where someone becomes unconscious as a defense mechanism. Again, not their choice, their body chooses for them. And in that state, their body essentially becomes floppy, their muscles aren't rigid. Friend or appease is the one conscious defense mechanism we can choose. And this is where someone will actually say yes or be nice to the person or do whatever that person asks of them because they're so fearful of that individual. So having an understanding of consent and knowing that consent can only be given when it's freely given, that allows us to recognize when there's threat, intimidation, coercion, or force, that if someone is saying yes in that state, that's a defense mechanism, not an indication of consent. So really understanding that is important. Looking at memories very quickly, recognizing that how our hippocampus is working when we're experiencing trauma, instead of actually storing memories in that nice linear chronological order like it normally would, the hippocampus is busy in defense mode. And so our memories are actually stored in unconnected, nonlinear ways, often connected to sensory information and fragmented, infused with intense emotion. And so to retrieve those memories is not so simple. We can't just retrieve them in a nice chronological order and give an investigator a timeline. And it means that we have inconsistent statements due to errors in recall, because what I can remember initially after the incident might look different than what I can remember a week later, a month later, or 6 months later as I regain those memories. And that will lead us into our presentation of delayed reporting, which is very expected when we have a trauma-informed lens. Recognizing that when people are talking about what's happened, they might avoid eye contact, fidget or stammer, and they'll display a wide range of emotional responses, and not always ones we'll expect. So sometimes people will speak very matter-of-factly and display no emotion. They might giggle and laugh while they talk about something, or they could be very distressed and crying while they go through a situation, and recognizing that. So as you can see, there are so many aspects within a trauma-informed lens that helps us look at a case from a science-based response, where we're actually recognizing how people's bodies react to trauma and how they might then explain that to us and display later on. If we lack this lens when we conduct an investigation into sexual violence, we will not have accurate investigation outcomes, and we risk harming those in our process. Next slide, please. Tip number 4 is to mitigate rape myth acceptance. So this does not bias your investigation analysis. And so this is thinking about how we're humans and we all buy into some rape myths at some level because we've been taught about it, because it makes us feel safe. Rape myths automatically blame victims and absolve perpetrators of guilt. But as humans, if we think, ooh, the victim did something that made this happen to them, I'm not going to act that way, it makes us feel safer in our community if we buy into these myths. So it's something that we very commonly do. And it's okay because we're human and we're allowed to have bias, and that's a natural part of being human. But as investigators, we need to recognize when rape myths actually are biasing our investigation, leading to inaccurate outcomes. So next slide, please. We're going to look at one specific myth, which is women provoke rape by the way they dress or act. Now let's focus on the bit about the way they dress. Anytime we're thinking about a case, what we want to analyze is considering as any bias coming into our discussion of the case, how we're treating any of the parties, how we're analyzing evidence. So here are some questions you can consider to help neutralize any potential bias, and particularly in relation to rape myths. So what are the facts that refute the myth? And always holding those facts in the forefront of your mind. Even if you don't think that you're going to be impacted by a myth, it's important to remind yourself of those facts and put those at the front of your analysis in an investigation. Think about how these beliefs might enter into your questioning or behavior to either of the parties. So for example, if we buy into the idea that women could provoke rape by the way they dress, when we know that dress has nothing to do with consent, we can be completely naked or completely covered. That's got nothing to do with someone consenting to sexual contact, and is absolutely not inviting someone to then assault another person. But we need to recognize, are we asking reporting parties questions like, well, what were you wearing? And what did you think would happen if you were wearing that? If that's the case, we are absolutely biased by that myth in our investigation. And if a reporting party comes into an investigation interview dressed in something we consider immodest, how might that bias how we assess their credibility and how we place blame on what's happened in an investigation? But also thinking about how any party might be using rape myth acceptance to try to minimize or rationalize the actions of a responding party. This could be our reporting party who internalizes rape myth and is holding guilt and shame for what's happened, trying to say, well, I shouldn't have done this, and well, I did go into this person's room, when we know that that's nothing to do with consent. A responding party often uses rape myths to minimize their own behavior and shift blame to the reporting party. Witnesses might do this, and investigators, we might run into this as well. So this is a way to kind of check ourselves and make sure that we're not letting any bias come into our investigation or our analysis of a case. Next slide, please. And so just highlighting that impacts of rape myth that always brings an implicit and explicit bias. And as a reminder, we have other biases around people's protected characteristics, age, ethnicity, nationality, race, gender, all the different things, belief systems. We're humans. And so we want to make sure that we're considering any unconscious and conscious bias isn't impacting our investigation so that we do a good job. But in relation to rape myths, we know it's going to blame a victim and absolve perpetrators of guilt, and it will always minimize and justify rape. So, a resource for you, I'm going to give you 3, hopefully, because I love to give you resources, is this Rape and Sexual Offenses Annex A, Tackling Rape Myths and Stereotypes from the Crown Prosecution Service. I highly recommend you checking out this webpage. It has a number of myths, about 40, that the Crown Prosecution Service has said, hey, these myths could impact an investigation in a case. And then it provides implications for what those myths could do if you believed those myths. It then provides ways to mitigate from those myths impacting an investigation, and also provides some case law to help you understand, from legal terms, where that comes into play. And although we're not a criminal justice process by any means, and we want to stay far away from that, thinking about a case from a civil perspective, we still need to recognize that rape myths can impact our investigations. And this is a wonderful resource to help you work through checking a case to make sure you've not been impacted by a myth in your analysis of that investigation. Next slide, please. So 2 other resources for you, if it's helpful, is a chapter 13 written by Carl Norcliffe and Andrea Pescott, 2 investigators I work with, called Investigation Interviewing, in the book Stopping Gender-Based Violence in Higher Education, and chapter 8, Trauma-Informed Investigations in Addressing Student Sexual Violence in Higher Ed. Both of those chapters expand more on what I've discussed today in these 2 tips. If they can be helpful, I hope that you can use them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clarissa. And I think Emily, are you on?
Yes. Oh, yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. So I know that you're on your phone because you were having Wi-Fi issues. So we'll go back
Yeah.
to
Yeah, I think this weather has just done in my Wi-Fi. So yes, I am on my phone. Apologies.
Okay, well, the floor is yours. We're starting with now. We're going back to tip 1 with you.
Cool. Okay. And yeah, sorry everybody about this. So yeah, for those of you who don't know, my name is Emily Setti. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology here, and I do a lot of young people, adolescents and young adults, about their understandings of consent and how they approach their sexual interactions when it comes to issues of consent, and so on. Oh, so this might be my Wi-Fi problems now on my phone. I don't know what it's like, Melissa.
Yeah, you've been going in and out, but keep
Yeah,
trying.
okay. Do you want to like go to someone else and then I'll try and figure this out. Get to somewhere maybe that's a little bit better.
Okay, so let's go back to tip number 5. Sorry about this. Going back and forth through the tips, but you'll still get all 8 of them in the end.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You can. Wonderful. Okay, tip number 5. This is all about considering how to meet survivor needs of control, trust, understanding, and compassion and safety within the boundaries of our roles as investigating officers. And before I say anything, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we can't be, if we are investigating officer, we can't also act in the same time as support for them. So they ideally would need to have a different staff member assigned as a point of contact for them, who ideally has training in these matters and can signpost them and keep them updated during the investigation. But what I will say is that there are still ways for us to consider meeting those needs, even though we are limited as investigating officers. And how we respond to those needs will make a difference in that person's trust in us, in the investigative process, as well as towards their path towards healing. So in many cases, people who are subjected to sexual violence, they suffer the loss of control. And in many cases of betrayal of trust, because as we know, it's very common that it's not somebody who they didn't know, it's not a stranger, it's somebody who they did know. So they were feeling helpless. And that's why it's so important to give them control where we can. We won't always be able to do that, but where we can, through the process and through the way we conduct the interview, and empower them by giving options and choices whenever it's possible. So yes, it is true that we have to be impartial as investigators, but if we strive to be objective and neutral in our attitude, but do that in a manner that lacks compassion and warmth, it can be problematic, because we know that for an interview to be successful in general, we need to have that rapport, we need to have that connection and compassion. And these are necessities if we want to obtain the most complete, accurate, and objective information. So if you are perceived as uncaring and uncold, then the person, the interviewee, may be feeling unsafe, and then may be unable to recall important information, because we know that stress impairs memory retrieval. Can you still hear me okay? Yeah? Perfect. Okay, so the important message here is that we need to show compassion. We can be impartial, but we can still convey warmth and respect, even when the interview is saying can be confusing at first, it may sound unbelievable. So it's important not to convey that disbelief or cold neutrality. And also we need to have patience through our communication and also through our body language, not expressing impatience or rushing them in any way. So having said that, I just want to acknowledge that there are many challenges. It's problematic to do that because most of the times a professional investigative interview is characterized by uncertainty, pressure, stress, and asymmetric communication. So how we handle those challenges as professional interviewers really determines the outcome of the interview. Our actions and the way we behave, the way we question, is not only going to impact on the quantity and reliability of the information we collect, but also on the conclusions that are drawn, and ultimately the trust that that person or the people affected will have in you and in the institution. So when I say asymmetric communication, what I mean by that is that you have more power as investigating officer in that. You may not feel like that, but this is how it looks like from the interviewee's perspective. You're going to be the authority figure. It's not going to be the first time that you're conducting an interview. You have experience in that. You know what to expect. You have the topics or the questions that you want to ask. You are in control of that meeting. In contrast, the person who you're interviewing doesn't have any experience. They have no control. They have no idea what to expect. So giving them control to say what happened in their own way as a narrative without interruption is really key. And we talked about giving them options and choices. Very simple things like offering them if they want a drink, or letting them choose when they want to take breaks, where they sit in the interview room. I know there are very simple things, but they can be experienced as compassionate and empowering for them. Uncertainty. Well, they don't know what to expect. Most of the times, this is going to be the first time that they go through this process. Maybe they read the process or the procedure or the guidance before they came to this interview with you. But as we know, sometimes it's difficult for staff members to understand our procedures in some institutions, so let alone for students. So they really don't know what to expect. And that's why it's so important to structure your interview in a way that you can go through a phase of engaging and explaining. And I can't go into a lot of details about all the structure, but that is a very important part to build rapport and ensure that you reduce that uncertainty and you build that trust in a very short amount of time. The only thing I would say here is don't rattle off a prepared list of bullet points, because that can be perceived as empathetic or, in the worst case scenario, fake. It needs to be second nature, and you can't be rushing it or just going through it. Like, you just need to get it done, over and done with. And then finally, I want to talk about pressure and stress, because this is so important to consider. They will be very stressed coming into that interview. They will probably have to tell you details, intimate details of something really difficult, and that comes it's really difficult for most of us to do that, especially with a stranger. And additional stress during an interview can really impair a person's prefrontal cortex and their capacities to maintain attention on the interview, retrieve critical pieces of memory, and that's key, because that's what we want them to do, get back on track after feeling overwhelmed because they spoke about something so difficult, and also resist getting lost in trauma-related responses to you. So pressure and stress are important things to consider. So now that we have the challenges, I just want to give you some tips on how to overcome these challenges. And I want to start off by talking about the green bit, which is allowing 2 sleep cycles. And I just want to preface this by saying this is not a fixed rule. There is no magic formula of 2 sleep cycles. And this comes from law enforcement, when the practice was that they need to allow 2 sleep cycles before they conduct an in-depth interview with their victims. And there was kind of some controversy around that, because they said that there was no scientific basis as to why you need 2 sleep cycles. However, the science of stress, trauma, and impact on memory and the role of sleep, there are some key findings that we need to consider. The first one is that sleeps preserve some details in memory, but not others. So, for example, emotionally significant central details will be enhanced. So the retention of those will be enhanced, but peripheral details won't. And unfortunately, sometimes what seems peripheral to the person's brain during the assault, it will be of central importance to the investigation. So it's important to bear that in mind. Second thing, stress impairs retrieval of memories. This is a very important thing to consider. And then third thing, sleep can reduce stress. So when we consider that, kind of you can see that, yes, allowing 2 sleep cycles is not necessarily something that is ideal, but you do need to consider giving them some time before you conduct that in-depth interview, allowing them to get support from their loved ones and from support services, allow them time to rest, to reduce stress, and to kind of begin processing what happened to them. So the bottom line is there is no universal time frame for that. It doesn't have to be 2 sleep cycles or less. It can be less, it can be more. It's just about considering their unique needs. They have to be approached as unique people with unique needs at a very difficult time in their life. So that's one, the green one. Then I would like to talk about addressing immediate concerns. So it's good practice before you go into asking the questions to start to think about addressing immediate concerns to reduce their cognitive load and potentially free up cognitive capacity for the difficult task of remembering. So before you go on and ask your questions, it's good practice to open up for questions just to, maybe there is something playing up in their mind. And if you don't open it up for questions, you have no opportunity to clarify that, and that can play in their minds during the interview, which will distract them from thinking about what happened and telling that to you what happened. So I talked about asymmetric communication in the previous slide. So the way to reduce asymmetry and create predictability, you do that by clarifying the parameters of the interview. You're going to be talking about, initially, you're going to clarify how you're going to be talking about stuff. So you're going to communicate about the way you will communicate. This is what the meta contract means. And because information is power, sharing the information that you have about the way you're going to conduct the interview is kind of sharing that power. And that is how you reduce asymmetry. Explain that you have the training and listening to the type of story they're going to share, and that you're prepared to absorb all types of information and are used to addressing difficult details, because sometimes they may try, consciously or unconsciously, to save you from hearing the most horrific details of the experience. So just establishing ground rules from the start is really key. It gives them a sense of security, and they know how you're going to be running that meeting. And the reasons to do that is very simple. This is just to overcome common misunderstandings of what sometimes happens during interviews. So they may not appreciate the level of detail that is required in investigations. So you have to say at the start, the more detail, the better. It doesn't matter of the confidence that they have in their accuracy of recall or whether they feel the information is irrelevant. So you can say, leave that to me. Don't decide whether something is relevant or not. Just leave that to me to do. They may believe that is appropriate to make up answers. So that's why they can be encouraged to say, I don't know, or I don't remember. However, be careful not to make it too easy for them to say, I don't remember. It's very difficult to remember, to recall. That's a very difficult task. So if it's okay to say, if you don't remember, that's fine. But if you do remember, please say so. The interviewee may assume that it's not appropriate to use slang, swear words, or sexually explicit language, despite them being the only or most suited ones to describe what happened. So you can say, you can use any words that will work. I will not be shocked, angry, or upset. And sometimes they will say they do know the answer. They don't know to answer the answer to a question when they actually don't understand the question. And they may not report any information if they think that you already know. So you can say, tell me as if I know nothing about what happened. Tip number 6, cover the incident topic first before you move on to anything else. So Clarissa mentioned this, that shame, blame, and guilt are common feelings for survivors of sexual assault. And there is a discrepancy between what people believe they will do and the reality, like Clarissa just beautifully mentioned earlier. And thank you for explaining that so well. And this is not just for us as investigators when we put ourselves in that situation and think, what would I have done? But also for the reporting party. That plays a key role. They may themselves hold the societal rape myths that Clarissa mentioned, which if they do hold that, it's very likely that it will increase the feelings of the guilt. And guilt we know from research that guilt has implications on disclosures because they may attempt to conceal or alleviate their guilt by omitting information from their disclosures or modifying information. So to reduce likelihood of omissions, it's better to structure the interview by covering the incident topic first before going to what happened before or what happened afterwards or any other topics that you may wish to cover. Well, and the other benefit of doing that is that you get the most difficult part out of the way. And then after they've talked about something really difficult, they can kind of breathe and relax because everything else is not going to be as difficult. And just the last slide before I hand over to Emily is just about how to do that, how to cover that incident topic in the best possible way. And this works for any topic, not just the incident topic. And this model here is called the hierarchy of reliability. It's essentially what it means is that you need to think about the way you're asking questions can impact on the quality of the answer provided. So the rule is that the free recall, so the top is the most reliable way of getting information. And also you will get the most information by asking that first. So if you start with a free recall and then move down to exploratory questions and clarifying questions, this is the way to do it to prevent contaminating the account. Because the way you ask questions, you're going to influence potentially the answer that that the person will give you. So it's thinking about the free recall as a Kinder egg. It's the most effective and ethical, and you're going to get the most information if you use that. And that is because your influence is minimal at that stage. So hopefully if you start with a free recall, you're going to get a full account, and it's going to mean that you're not going to go and ask loads of other questions. You may have to ask some questions, but the rule is the less questions you ask, the better quality it is. So if you speak more than the interviewee during the interview, that's a sign that it's not going very well. And does that mean that we're going to get the information that we get via free recall is always reliable? No, of course not. But it's just kind of increasing the likelihood of getting reliable information from if you use this technique. So on that note, I'm going to pass on to Emily, who is hopefully here.
Hi, yeah, I'm hoping that I have better Wi-Fi where I am now.
Yes, I think we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Amazing.
Yes.
I might just keep my screen off though, just to make sure that I maximize the connection, if that's okay. But yeah, all right. So sorry everybody for the dramas that have ensued. So yeah, I'm not sure what you gathered from what I said before, but I am I do research with adolescents and young adults about their understandings of consent and how they approach that in their intimate relationships. And there are some implications of that for allegations of sexual misconduct that I will share with you now. And so the first is this idea of trying to conceive of consent as working as a form of layers rather than a kind of one set idea as to what it constitutes. So the understanding from the literature is that consent comprises both an internal feeling of willingness and an external communication of that willingness. And then whatever behavior that willingness is externally communicated through, that somebody interprets as willingness. And when you have those three pieces come together, then you have a legitimately consensual interaction. So that kind of covers the bases of our understandings of the law of consent around the idea that it must be freely given and with capacity and so on, and that relates to that idea of internal feeling of willingness. So seemingly straightforward, but we will see in a moment why potentially not. So just next slide, please. So what I and others have found when talking about these issues with young people, be they adolescents or young adults, is that internal and external consent and what people interpret as consent don't necessarily always align in a 100% coherent way. So we know that consent to be legitimate or at least reasonable or present does not actually require the person to explicitly want in full 100% whatever it is that they are agreeing to, but they should be willing to offer that agreement, that consent. And so what you find, however, is that sometimes people may appear or even go down the route of agreeing and consenting without necessarily a full feeling of willingness for the sexual activity. So that might be because of various pressures and expectations that surround the situation, or you know, a desire for a relationship and not wanting to let somebody down. It might be due to intoxication. There are various reasons why someone might appear to be consenting when they're not actually willing. And likewise, an initiator or responding party may interpret consent despite an absence of willingness, and that might take place regardless of whether there was an intent to communicate any consent. So there might be various reasons why a responding party might think consent was present when actually there wasn't, and that might relate to intoxication on the part of the responding party, a disregard or a disinterest as to whether consent was truly present, or various things in between. So just a miscommunication about maybe what the person was intending with their communication. We find when we speak to young people, including young adults, that sometimes the moment of consent, according to the person initiating and requesting consent, can be earlier on in the process than the actual moment at hand where the sexual activity is taking place. For example, if someone has agreed to go back to someone's bedroom with them or has flirted with them previously, and that can be taken as, well, I assume that they were comfortable with whatever happened subsequently. So we can start to see how these different layers of consent, as we call them, start to break down. So next slide. And so the implications of some of this from a perspective of why an allegation of sexual misconduct might arise, and then the implications for investigating it, is that questions arise regarding at what point the responding party is responsible for any incongruence between internal and external consent. Because a individual may be experiencing pressure or a set of expectations, or may even be intoxicated. There may be various factors going on. And to what extent does the responding party become responsible for if consent seems to be given, but is actually not corresponding with an internal feeling of willingness? When should that responding party have identified that and taken steps to address that, or not engaged in the sexual activity at all? Likewise, what counts as consent communication? So if we're talking about somebody feeling that they did not actually communicate consent in that given situation, but the responding party believes that they did, and there are various behavioral or verbal cues that they took as indicative of consent communication, where do we say, yes, that is reasonable, or no, that is not reasonable? And when we ask ourselves these questions, and we may draw a conclusion that, in fairness, a responding party cannot be held responsible in this scenario, as unfortunate as it may be. A responding party was reasonable in believing that consent was present. That might be the outcome of the process, but what kind of due care and attention do we need to give to the reporting party? Because their feelings of incongruence around willingness and external consent may actually be quite valid. And that links to the next tip that I'll talk about in a moment. And whilst this may not be the primary purpose of a sexual misconduct investigation or hearing, we do then need to step back and think about our messaging and our approach around whether or not we are encouraging a deeper understandings of the nuances of consent and the conditions in which individuals formulate and enact consent. We can draw certain conclusions about who's responsible in a given scenario, but there might want to be things that we say and do to impart an argument or a consent culture that addresses some of these deeper complexities. So going on then, I think, to the next tip, which is related to some of this, is this idea of binary approaches within adversarial, not that you probably want to see it as an adversarial process, but whereby an investigation will lead to either a complaint being upheld or not, so, or an allegation being upheld or not. And what that can sometimes lead to, and this is something I speak with young people about a lot, whether it be a formal criminal justice process or a more informal process of investigation, there is a belief that, well, you know, if somebody is alleging that the situation was not consensual or it was unwanted in some way, well, then it will be investigated. And if the allegation is upheld, then it means that it's true. And if the allegation is not upheld, it must mean that it was false and that the person was lying, and that the person the responding party didn't do anything wrong. And so there's a very binary, it was either true or false, and we're on one person's side or the other. And something that we try to disentangle with adolescents and young adults is this idea of, if an allegation is not upheld, does that mean that the person bringing the allegation was lying? So next slide. And this is a very kind of topical public kind of discourse at the moment around false accusations. And this is particularly propagated the idea that boys and young men are at risk of being falsely accused by girls and young women of unwanted or non-consensual sexual activity. And what you find is that this comes from an overly legalistic framing of sexual behavior as either legal or illegal. And if it's not upheld formally, then that must mean that it was all fine and nothing really happened, and maybe the person was even lying. And various claims are made about the likelihood of this occurring. So next slide. So what I think is important to impart is that it is perfectly possible within a given situation, sexual interaction or so on, that both parties have different understandings of the same event. And a responding party may genuinely believe that they were reasonable in concluding that consent was present, and the reporting party genuinely feels that they did not want what happened, and that either they did communicate that, or they feel violated to such an extent that they believe that they communicated that, but maybe potentially they didn't. And so there are a lot of grey areas, and there's a lot of kind of clash of perceptions that might go on within a given situation. And so something to impart is this idea about evidence and the way in which misconduct allegations are investigated and concluded. And in some regards, they aren't making a judgment as to whether people are telling the truth or lying. They're making a judgment as to where the evidence points to and what is reasonable to conclude on the basis of the facts and the evidence at hand. And that is important. Again, it goes back to this idea of internal, external consent and how consent is communicated. It is not always black and white. It is not always clear, and people may have different understandings of what is being communicated and felt within that situation, and who's responsible or not, where things break down and an allegation of misconduct is made. And that's important within given cases, because these cases do not just affect the direct individuals involved. Inevitably, within a university situation, like in a school situation, there are wider peer dynamics that unfold, and people take sides and people make various claims about the individuals directly involved in the situation. And very clear messaging needs to go out about what the scope and the nature of an investigation or panel hearing involves, and what it can arbitrate over, and the conclusions that it can draw. So hopefully these two tips kind of correspond with each other and relate to a bit the broader culture that we want to uphold or create, or at least not kind of hinder, through the way in which these misconduct allegations are handled from an institutional and formal perspective. So I think that's it from me, and I apologize again for my connection problems.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for hanging in there and trying. Very good. So now we're going to move down to tip number 7 with Amy Knight.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Just a bit of background. So the team that I work in is the Office of Student Complaints, Appeals and Regulation at the University of Surrey. So we are known as OSCR, and we are responsible, among other things, for managing student disciplinary proceedings, including investigations and panel hearings relating to cases of sexual misconduct involving students. So procedural fairness in cases of sexual misconduct is a difficult concept to navigate for universities in the current climate, particularly in the wake of the high-profile court cases that have happened recently, such as the AB versus XYZ case and the Feeder and McCavish judgments, with which I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on some practical steps which we have taken successfully at Surrey to help improve procedural fairness for both reporting and responding parties in cases of sexual misconduct. So that brings me to my first tip, tip 7, which is procedural fairness for the reporting party requires an equitable approach that gives their voice parity with that of the responding party throughout the misconduct process. So the way we did investigations in the past, we would often find that the voice of the reporting party would easily get lost during the student disciplinary process. Once their statement had been taken by the investigator, the reporting party would have little in the way of further input and few rights to access information and evidence concerning their case. This would create an imbalance in the process where the voice of the responding party would come to dominate the case and obscure that of the reporting party. So we now understand that reporting parties should not be treated as mere witnesses in the proceedings, but as core participants. So next slide. Okay, so some steps that we have taken to address this imbalance. So in the initial stages of receiving the report, reporting parties are now assigned a named point of contact who they can contact for information and guidance throughout the process. This person is often one of our trained sexual violence liaison officers. And this person acts as a constant presence throughout the process to keep the reporting party updated and signposted to appropriate services. The point of contact has no other involvement with the case and doesn't act as point of contact for the responding party. If any precautionary measures or restrictions are imposed on the responding party, such as an exclusion from certain parts of campus or a no contact order, this will be explained to the reporting party, and the formal letter to the responding party will be shared with them to avoid any confusion. The reporting party will be reassured that the responding party is prohibited from contacting them in any form, and that they will be kept updated of any changes to the restrictions. Next slide. So during the investigation, so we now record investigative interviews with reporting parties with their consent, of course. So with reporting parties, we have found that this practice of recording the interviews greatly enhances the impact of their evidence and helps to ensure that their voice has parity with that of the responding party. This method is particularly effective where a case progresses to a panel hearing, as the members of a panel will have access to the recording as part of the evidence bundle and will benefit from being able to hear a comprehensive account that includes the subtleties of intonation and expression that are missed with purely textual evidence. We found that the recordings make for powerful evidence, quite literally giving the reporting party a voice in the process. And this also has the benefit of reducing the need for the reporting party to repeat the details of their account on multiple occasions. So before recording, it's very important to explain to the reporting party that the recording will be used as evidence and will therefore likely be shared with the responding party and other relevant parties involved in the process. And we would normally provide a transcript to the responding party and would allow them to attend our office to view the recording if they wished. So that avoids the need to give the responding party an actual copy of the recording, because obviously we don't necessarily want them to possess a copy of that recording. So the reporting parties often also have the opportunity to review and respond to the evidence given by the responding party while the case is still at the investigation stage. So if privacy constraints mean that we can't show them the recording itself, the reporting party is generally provided with a summary outlining the key disparities between the two accounts of events. And we found that this enhances equity between the two parties and helps strengthen evidence, as the reporting party can often explain inconsistencies and rebut counter narratives advanced by the responding party. The reporting party's reply is included in the evidence bundle if the case proceeds to a panel hearing. The reporting party is informed of the outcome of the investigation, and in cases when there's an outcome of no further action, or if the allegation is not proven, or if a minor penalty is issued, the reporting party will be offered the opportunity to attend a meeting with the investigator where the reasons for this outcome will be explained and any questions or concerns will be addressed. If the case is proceeding to a panel hearing, the reporting party will be informed of when and where this is due to take place, and the investigator or point of contact will explain what the process involves and whether the reporting party is likely to be required to attend the hearing. Okay, next slide. So at the hearing, so since the AB versus XYZ judgment, reporting party attendance at panel hearings has become a more contentious issue, and we're still in the process of adapting to this new development. We prefer to take a trauma-informed approach that aims to capture all of the evidence for the reporting party that is required at the investigation stage through an in-depth recorded interview, like I've just described. However, if the reporting party is called to attend the hearing, we would ensure this is approached sensitively. For example, the reporting party would never be in the same physical location as the responding party, and questions will be filtered through the panel chair. All of our panel members for sexual misconduct cases receive specific enhanced training in this area. If the responding party is legally represented, we would consider offering this to the reporting party, though this can present some challenges. And if the responding party introduces salient new evidence or information at the hearing stage that hasn't already been addressed during the investigation, the chair would usually adjourn the hearing so that the reporting party can be offered right of reply. Next slide, please. So after the hearing, we share student disciplinary panel outcomes with the reporting party and also offer to meet them to discuss this and the reason behind the panel's decision. And where possible, we meet with reporting parties after the case has concluded to seek feedback on every aspect of the handling of their case, including first disclosure through to the months after their case ended and everything in between. Ongoing support will be offered where needed. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next tip is about the responding party. So procedural fairness for the responding party requires an impartial and transparent approach throughout the misconduct process. So it can be challenging to balance the needs of both parties in sexual misconduct investigations. Investigators have to be mindful to maintain an impartial approach and remain unbiased in their inquiries. Adopting a trauma-informed approach to reporting parties doesn't mean that the principles of fair evidence gathering can be abandoned. So next slide. So in the initial stages of receiving the reports, responding parties, like with reporting parties, are also assigned a point of contact who they can go to for information and guidance throughout the process. as well as information about support services. And this is never the same person as who is acting as a point of contact for the reporting party. And if we are imposing precautionary restrictions on the responding party, we will always meet with them in person to explain the process. And we always emphasize that it's a neutral act designed to give some breathing space to allow the investigation to be conducted fairly. The responding party also has the right to make initial representations and separately appeal against precautionary restrictions. The nature of the allegation against the responding party is always outlined in sufficient detail for the individual to understand what they are accused of and how this breaches university rules and regulations. The responding party will always be informed of who has made the allegations. Next slide. During the investigation, so if the reporting party is being interviewed first, which is almost always the case, there may be a delay before the responding party can attend an interview. This might cause some frustration, so it's important to explain the investigation structure to the responding party and keep them updated about when their interview is likely to take place. Make sure the responding party is fully informed of all the available support, such as through the Students' Union, and is reminded that a supporter can be present with them during the interview. And we also video or audio record interviews with responding parties with consent to ensure all the evidence is captured in the most accurate and effective way. And as with reporting parties, before recording, it's very important to explain how this evidence will be used and that it could be shared with the reporting party to obtain their right of reply. But the responding party should also have the option of submitting written or other evidence if they wish. Next slide. So at the hearing, ensure that the invitation letter makes it very clear that the responding party can call witnesses to attend the hearing, and this might include the reporting party, and that's particularly important considering the XYZ judgment. The right to legal representation is a contentious issue, so our current regulations make provision for a supporter to attend the hearing with the responding party, and this person can accompany them to the hearing, offer advice, ask questions and make statements. But the expectation is that the responding party will answer questions from the panel themselves. But the supporter could be someone who is legally trained. We would prefer to avoid a two-tier system where students who have the means to instruct a lawyer receive a different hearing process. Although we are having to reassess this part of our regulations following the AB versus XYZ case. So at the start of the hearing, the responding party should be informed of when and how the outcome will be delivered, and they may make requests for this to be communicated in a particular method at a particular time. Last slide. Okay, so in summary, procedural fairness can be upheld for both parties by being transparent about the processes and sharing information and evidence wherever possible in an appropriate and structured way. And that's it. I'll hand you back to Melissa.
Thank you, Amy. So you had our 8 tips, although you might be thinking that we misrepresented because you actually got lots of tips, many more than 8. So I guess I should have called it 8 groups of tips. So lots of information. We do have another webinar upcoming, as you can see on your screen. Again, these slides will be made available to you, so you don't need to jot down the time, but you could see in 2 weeks. This one's going to be about sexual misconduct in healthcare education, more specifically about how fitness to practice hearings may be different. And even though it's geared toward their expert panel will be from the healthcare industry, a lot of what they'll address is translatable to other types of professions where fitness to practice is relevant. So that will be another free webinar, as you can see, in 2 weeks' time. And the link to sign up for that will be on the slides that you will get. Next slide, please. If you're interested in what the University of Surrey has been doing in terms of sexual misconduct case toolkit, a lot of which has been represented here today, you will have there then the website as well as the email account. Next slide, please. So we will go into questions and discussion. And this could be any questions you have of anybody who has presented, although I think Emily said he will have to leave a little bit early. But it also could be any comments that you have in your experiences or as professionals, or yes, any experiences that you have are relevant to anything that has been discussed today that you might think that others might listen to, because this forum is for all of us to learn together. And I can see that for the first one is, oh, in the next slide, we put up a questionnaire, and then I will call on Colette. So here's a QR code. If you could answer our questionnaire on this, please. Feedback for what we're doing. We've been given these webinars. Some of you have attended all of them. If you want more webinars, you can give us ideas. So Colette Davies has raised her hand. If you want to unmute, I believe you can, and ask your question or make your comment. Colette, are you able to unmute, or do I need to unmute you? Unmute her. I'm not seeing her on the list. Somehow she has dropped out. Lance Thomas, you have your hand raised. What would you like to say?
Yeah, thank you. It was a question for Amy. You mentioned about recording of reporting parties.